So, oh, wait a minute. I don't think everyone can see my screen. Let me share my screen. There we go. So yesterday we started this halacha that there's a mitzvah to build a ma'akeh, a parapet around your roof. I believe that we finish all of the okay, yeah, we had just done the biurim, which is what is the when does the obligation of building a ma'akeh set in? Does the obligation start once you've built the house? In other words, when you're building the house, do you have to install the ma'akeh? Or do you have to install the ma'akeh only when you start living in the house? And that was the machlokes that we saw. And the Imrei Yaakov said that logic would dictate based on the halacha that you're only obligated to build the ma'akeh once you occupy the home and you start using it. However, there are some poskim who say that you have an obligation to build it as soon as you build the house. And therefore, he says it's unclear. It's unclear. Another issue that we saw is that you make a bracha when you make the ma'akeh. So first, let's take a look at the likutim over here. Mitzvat aseh, it's a positive commandment to build a ma'akeh. He says, Hama'ayin b'sefer hakadosh eitz chayim ha'ari, someone who looks at the holy sefer, which is a Kabbalistic work called Eitz Chaim, which was, I believe, written by Reb Chaim Vital, the premier student of the Arizal, quoting the Ariz Torah, b'mitzvahs ma'akeh, yavin midvarav shahamavatol mitzvahs ma'akeh ki'ilu machzir ha'olam letohu vavohu. That if a person neglects this mitzvah, it's tantamount to returning the world to chaos and void. Ki pol hashefa hanofel b'li ma'atzor, because it causes a collapse not only of a person to fall off of his roof, but on a Kabbalistic level, building a ma'akeh contains the shefa, the divine emanation that God wishes to bring down into this world. And by a person failing to build this parapet, he's doing much more than just creating a hazard. He's preventing some kind of divine emanation from having some substance to it, some kiyum. And obviously this transcends, regular understanding of the mitzvah, but apparently it has a lot of Kabbalistic ramifications. Now, Lasos Adam Ma'akeh, to build a parapet, the Sefer Machane Ephraim, done b'misharot salasos ma'akal yedei uman goy o yavarech aleha. There's a deliberation in this Sefer that if you build the parapet via a non-Jewish worker, do you make a bracha on it or not? Obviously, you can put up the parapet any way you want, as we'll see in just a moment. That's not so clear. But at first glance, this is only about whether or not you make a bracha. So if I have someone else build the parapet for me, then I wouldn't be it's a question whether I can make the bracha on it. And the opinion of Machane Ephraim is that you could make a bracha because he's acting as your proxy. And since he's acting as your proxy, so therefore you can make the bracha. Umashmos devarav sham diyesh chiluch b'masauhu al yedei uman she'oved b'kablanus. But he says, Rav Stern writes that it sounds like from his responsum that it depends on how you've hired him. If you've hired him as a kablan, as a contractor, to build a parapet, and you're paying him, let's say, $5,000 to build the parapet, and it doesn't matter how long he takes, it's his job to complete, then you would not make a bracha, because then he's not acting as your proxy, but rather is more of an independent worker. But according to the Knesses Hagdola, the worker would make, if he's Jewish, he himself would make the bracha. Aval imasahu al yedei uman poel shehu schir yom. But if you do it, if the work arrangement is that you pay him by the day or by the hour, and it's not paid by the job, which is what we call a schir yom, afilu ha'uman hu nachri shaper matzi ha'balabayis levarech alav. Then the balabayit could make the bracha, even if the worker is a non-Jew. The chashiv ki'ilu hu atzmo asahu, because then there's more of a proxyship kind of relationship between the employer and the employee. Aval yesh cholkim al zed, the sfira le'dimos ha'yedei nachri ein levarech klal. But there are other opinions. He quotes the Stei Chemed, which is an encyclopedic work from the 19th century, who says that no, there are opinions that say that you would never make a bracha if you build a parapet via a non-Jew. The Minchas Chinuch goes so far as to say a huge chiddush that if you build the whole thing via a non-Jew, you don't even fulfill the mitzvah, which is surprising. I mean, I'm shocked that he would even suggest such a thing, because the whole mitzvah is to have a protection around your roof. But apparently, I guess the way to do it is in some way to participate, maybe to ask him, is it okay if I screw in some screws to this parapet while you're building it, and that way you're participating. And then related to that is yesh levarich, you make a bracha lifnei haschalas asiyas hama'akeh. At what point do you make the bracha on the building of the ma'akeh? So one opinion is that you make the bracha over la'asiyasa, which is like other mitzvahs where the bracha is done before you start the mitzvah. So before you start putting up the ma'akeh, you're up on the roof. You've got all your building materials brought up. So the first, with the first, let's say, positioning of the post, you would make your bracha. But v'yesh misha omer levarech lifnei makosha acharon b'sha'a shesotem hapirtza ha'achrona. But some say that no, you make the bracha before the hammer blow of the last beam, where you completely secure the rooftop. Because only at that point is it considered to be a ma'akeh, a real parapet. So therefore, it would be more appropriate, and he's quoting here the Sefer Chasam Sofer, the Shilas and Shuvas Chasam Sofer, that you should make the bracha when you put up the last beam, because then you're creating now a ma'akeh at that moment. Right. I suppose so, because building a ma'akeh, depending on the size of the roof, could take days or weeks. Who knows? Okay. Okay.
And Rabbi, if you don't ever finish it, then you haven't done the job.
That's right.
So, and you've left it dangerous. So, it seems like the last spike would be the appropriate.
Yeah, that's what I would. That's what I would side with. That's what I would side with. Okay. Ligago, that you have to make it for your roof. Let's say you rent a house or you rent a property and there's a rooftop and it doesn't have a proper parapet. So hasocher chayav la'asos hama'akeh. Then the renter is the one who's obligated to build the ma'akeh. So you have, I suppose you'd have to get permission from the landlord to allow you to build some kind of. The truth is, if you have some kind of scaffolding, it's probably okay also. But we'll have to see some of the details of the halacha about how permanent and how sturdy the ma'akeh has to be.
And I wonder, Rabbi, if you're a renter, when you leave, can you take it with you, or do you have to leave it intact?
Right. Interesting. There's probably an obligation to leave it, I would imagine. Yeah. Okay.
Almost like the questions about mezuzah when you you sell.
Right. Exactly. Right. So the with the mezuzah, there's an obligation to leave it up if you know the next tenant is Jewish, because, and I don't remember the details of the reasoning behind that halacha. I don't remember that anymore. I learned it in depth at one time, but I'm trying to remember the reasoning behind that you have to leave the mezuzahs. I'm not sure if it's just a matter of chesed or whether there's a halachic imperative that you have to leave them up because the house is chayiv in mezuzah. It really seems that if the house is not owned by a Jew, the house is not chayiv in mezuzah. But once the house is owned by a Jew, the house becomes chayiv in mezuzah. I think that's what some of the poskim write. And it could be that if the house is owned by a Jew, it's chayiv in ma'akeh, regardless of whether the owner puts one up or not. And I guess maybe therefore you would not be allowed to remove it. Mm-hmm. It's a valid point. Okay. Beis HaKnesses u Beis HaMedrash she'en regilas klal li'ishtamesh al gagehem. We said that a synagogue or a Beis Medrash is pater from ma'akeh. Avol bor b'chatzer Beis HaKnesses chayiv b'ma'akeh. Now, here's something that is liable to have a ma'akeh, which is, let's say there's a pit in the courtyard of the synagogue. You would have to build a parapet around that to prevent people from falling in the pit. So the reason is because the courtyard is used by the public and a child could be running around. And I remember when my old shul, when I was a little boy, was undergoing renovation, and there was all these building materials. It was a pretty dangerous place for a kid to be running around. And that's what we used to do. When our dads would daven in shul, we'd run outside and get into trouble and get our clothes dirty and scuff our pants and get holes in them and everything. And then we'd come home and our mothers would yell at us, right? So you have to be careful that there's no hazardous material around the shul. You have to build a parapet around it, an area where a child could get into and fall and injure themselves. He quotes the Sefer, he quotes the Taz, who writes, Ani biyaldusi hayisi dar b'kila kedosha Krakow im b'nei beisi b'beis medrashi shahaya lamayla mi beis hakneses. He says, the Taz writes that when I was a younger man, I lived with my family in Krakow in the Beis Medrash that was above the synagogue. V'ne'anashti harbe b'misas b'ni. And God afflicted me by causing my son to die. V'talisi bazeh. And I assumed that it was because I had neglected to build a ma'akeh above the rooftop. In other words, he's not suggesting that his son died by falling off the roof. He had a Nebuchadnezzar child who passed away, could have been from some disease. But he says, the reason I believe why God was punishing me was because even though it was a Beis Medrash on top of a Beis HaKnesses, and we said that it's pater, but it all depends on the utility. And if indeed it's used as a living area and people could potentially go up on top of it, so then you have to build a parapet around it. And then he quotes the Mishnah Berurah as saying, Umasha minhag ha'olam ba'ayaros, shesochrim bate knesios lizman bebatim tachtim ulamayla mehen beis dira, shematzoi sham tinokos v'davar ma'us, efshar mishum shehu lizman lo chayshinan lazeh. So the Mishnah Berurah writes simply, he says that there is a custom that people rent synagogues for a period of time, and they use the certain rooms that are above the synagogue, and there are children there, and the children get the place dirty, and so the question is, what right do you have to do that? I mean, if we take a look, the Mishnah Berurah is talking about Hilchos Beis HaKnesses, Siman Kuf Nun Aleph. Let me just bring that up for just a moment so that we can take a look. I believe he's talking about not really the mitzvah of Makkah, but he's talking about the obligation to not bring anything unclean into a synagogue. And the question is, what right do these synagogues have? Let's see here. The Shulchan Aruch.
Is this when we designate a building as a shul only? Is it really back to that kind of issue?
Yeah, I think so. Hold on a second. Kuf Nun Aleph. Okay. Right. Okay. Let's see. Mishnah Berurah. Okay. One second. Kuf Nun Aleph. Okay, let me just share with you my screen so that you can see this. Hold on. So the Shulchan Aruch writes, Yesh li zaher milihishtamesh ba'aliyot shel gabe beit hakneses tashmish kavua shel ginai. A person has to be careful not to use the upper floors that are above a synagogue. Let's say, you have a synagogue on the ground floor, and then you have, let's say, classrooms above the synagogue. But you have to make sure that, let's say, you don't open up a school where the children's diapers get dirty constantly. Kagon lishgav sham ushar tashmishma. Let's say to sleep there and other utilities, let's say defecation, or bodily needs, it should not be done directly above a synagogue. Yesh liistapeki mutar liishtamesh bazeh. So it's unclear whether you'd be allowed to use the area that's immediately above a synagogue. Now, of course, this has many delicate questions associated with it. What happens if you build an apartment building with a synagogue on the ground floor? Does that mean that anyone who lives directly above the synagogue is not allowed to use their apartment? That doesn't make any sense. He says, the Rama writes, V'chol ze davka b'beis hakneses kavua, shenivna mitchila lekach. But that's only, says the Rama, if it's a synagogue that was originally built as a synagogue and then they built additional things above it. But if, let's say, you have a building, let's say a residential building like the conservatory, and it was built for residents, and then they take the party room and they turn it into a synagogue. So then there's no requirement for you to be careful about this halacha. So if we take a look at the Mishnah Berurah, he writes in Sifkat and Mem Aleph of Albayas Sheyichadu, that he quotes the Rama, and he says, "V'nira dekol shekain im b'shah shenivna beis hakneses nivna beis dira l'mayla mimenu." He says, and certainly, if a synagogue was built, and part of the plans of the building of the synagogue was that right above the synagogue was going to be, let's say, the sexton's home, which is very common. You build for the shamas, you build a residence right above the shul so that he can come down and take care of the needs of the shul. He says, the shari ladur sham. He says, then of course you're allowed to live there. Because then originally it was not sanctified. The airspace above the synagogue was not sanctified. But he says to use it for something that's very unclean, let's say for defecation, near a debechol gavni aser. It would seem that in all instances it would still be aser, even if it was built originally to be part of the plans of the synagogue. And therefore, you should never build the synagogue in an area where right above the synagogue, there's, let's say, a toilet or something like that. And I refer you to the Taz, who says that he believes that he was punished significantly with the loss of a child because he was not careful about this, and he had a living space above a synagogue, and he was not careful about this. Umasha minag ha'olam ba'ayarot shesochrim bate knesios lizman bebatim tachtim ulamayla mehen bezdira shematzu sham tinokos v'davar mos efsham misham shu lizman lo chashinon lazeh. And then that's where the Mishnah Berurah writes that the fact that sometimes people rent out rooms above a synagogue, let's say you go to a summer resort and the Chabad there has a Chabad house, and they rent out rooms for people to use for sleeping and the like, he says it could be that since it's only temporary, that people do it only for short periods of time, he says that could be the reason why you can be lenient. This halacha really is not related to the mitzvah of ma'akeh, and I can only conclude that the reason why the Likutim is bringing this halacha over here is because we're dealing with the obligation to build a ma'akeh on the rooftop of a Beis HaKnesses. Now, the Rav Shulchan Aruch had paskin that you don't have to because it's not used for that purpose. If it's only temporarily or rarely used for the rooftop is used, so then you're also pater. So he's bringing this whole halacha in to show us that I suppose there's similar principles that apply as far as using the upstairs of a shul for residential purposes. So you have to be careful for two reasons regarding having a residence above a shul. Number one, if you have a residence above a shul, then you'll have to build a ma'akeh because ultimately people will be going up there. But if it's only, but then you have to also be concerned about something else with a residence above a shul, which is to keep it clean and not to put a toilet directly over the shul. So I think that's the reason why he's bringing it over here, because really it's not that germane to the halacha of building a makkah, but it's indirectly connected. Okay. All right. So in the biurim over here, he says lefi hatam shekasav kan harav dahapturu mishum shein regilus klal yishtamesh al gagehan. He says the whole reason it seems that you're exempt from building a makkah above a synagogue is because people don't use the rooftop. But he says mashma mized de imregilim liyishtamesh al gagehem yesh chiyuv lasos makkah. The implication being is that if people do use the rooftop, let's say when there's an overflow in the base medrash, they make another minyan on the rooftop, right? So then you would have an obligation to build a makkah. Aval lefi zeh yesh lahakshos taharei bechulin darshinan gagecha lemeute bate knesios ubate midrashos. The problem is that the Gemara seems to imply that it's a gzeras hakasuv, that it's based on the language of the pasuk, that the Torah says you only have an obligation to build a parapet for your roof, gagecha, your roof, which excludes, let's say, a communal structure like a synagogue. Pirish Rashi shein chelak leechad bo she'af livnei ever hayamhu va'od she'eno beistira ad kan lashona. And Rashi points out that number one, it's not owned by any specific party; it's a public utility. And number two, it's not used for residential purposes. V'im nomar detam hapturu k'divrei harav kan she'mishtamshim al gagehem im kein lama tzarich l'mayit beis hakneses davka. He says, if the whole reason that you're putter from building a makkah on a synagogue is because it's not used regularly, then why do you need a special pasuk to exclude a synagogue because it doesn't have an owner? Because after all, every structure, even if it's owned by an individual party, would be exempt from a makkah if its roof is not being used. Which is why our rooftops are pater from makkah. He says, I refer you, he says, to the Chazon Ish, the Svirale be'emes, the Beis HaKnesses u'Beis HaMedrash pater, af hecha shemishtamshim al gabam. The Chazon Ish is of the opinion that synagogues and Batei Medrash are exempt from a makkah even if you do use the rooftop. The Gzeres HaKasavu, the Dafka hecha di'ika beis dira chayavim b'makkah. Because the Torah only obligates you in makkah when there's a residence beneath the roof. But if there's no residence, then there's no obligation. Because it's like climbing a tree, where there's no obligation to go over to a tree in your orchard just because people may climb the tree and to build a parapet around the tree. So then the question becomes, well, then why is it that a pit is obligated in ma'akeh? A pit is not a residence, right? So ayin sham b'Chazon Ish sifkat and beis mashakasav bazeh. So the Chazon Ish addresses that point. B'tzarach lomer disvirle laharav dahad demamatinan beis knesses u'beis medrash hainu mishum demistama ein mishtamshim al gabehem. He says you have to conclude that the Rav Shulchan Aruch is of a different opinion. His opinion is that the reason why a shul is exempt from a makkah is not because of a special biblical directive that the obligation of makkah is limited, but rather because it's not used. It's not used with regularity. Ach midivrei Rashi hanal muchach dehatam hu mishum shenu beis dira. But he says, but Rashi seems to disagree with that, as does the Rambam. And he goes along these lines. And what is his concluding statement? He says, Ulam lama'aseh nira diyesh lachush lahachmir uchadamashma meharav kan. His concluding statement is that it would seem that this is a machlokas, whether a synagogue whose rooftop is utilized is obligated in makkah or not. Because he's going through in this whole long thing, this whole back and forth among the poskim, and he says that it would seem that a person should be machmir to go like the Rav Shulchan Aruch, that if a synagogue has a rooftop that does have utility, that people do go up to the rooftop, you are obligated to build a ma'akeh. The only thing is that you would not make a bracha. Especially because there are Rishonim who hold that even for a home ma'akeh, you don't make a bracha. That makkah doesn't get a bracha at all. But the bottom line is, first of all, if you live in any kind of urban area, the city code is going to obligate you to build a wall or some fence anyway when you have a rooftop that is utilized for regular utility, for regular traffic, especially if it's a public building like a synagogue or something like that. There's no way that you could get away with having a rooftop deck and not have a parapet. But beyond that, there is an obligation halachically, at least according to the Rav Shulchan Aruch. So I think we'll hold it here, and we will resume in a couple of weeks. Probably not until the very beginning of the week of February 12th, I think it is. But we're off for a good 2.5 weeks. Okay, so 2 weeks from Monday is when we'll resume Bezrat Hashem. Okay, And
so with all that, Rabbi, travel safely.
thank you.
Stay off the roofs.